Why is it not playing? Okay, that's weird. Hello, welcome to Storytime. I just went to play my media asset and it's not playing for me. So I'm really sad about that. Hang on just a second. Hello, welcome to Storytime. I'm Dr. Jennifer Bird. I am a biblical scholar, and I care very much about what people do with what they find in the Bible. To that end, I like to have this Storytime conversation where I read biblical passages through my feminist, materialist, post-colonial lens, offering the commentary pretty much just as I think of it, or as I think ought to be talked about. Sometimes I bring on biblical scholars as to have a conversation with them. And today we get to have all three of the editors of a volume titled Transbiblical. And let me pull up the image very quickly. Transbiblical: New Approaches to Interpretation and Embodiment in Scripture. Very excited to have all three folks here. I'm going to very quickly tell you about them. Mellissa Harl Sellew is currently an adjunct professor at United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities, and that is UCC affiliated. Jay Marchal is professor of religious studies at Ball State University. They were here last year as well. Some of you may remember Jay. And Katy was also here last year. Katy Valentine is also a PhD in New Testament studies and is currently has a spiritual coaching practice. I very much enjoy Katy's insights into some of the more non-traditional elements of our lives. Anyway, so I am delighted to have them here. And as a person who cannot fully wrap my head around trans experiences, I'm just pleased to be able to create a space to talk about these realities, and a trans hermeneutic. So I'm going to go ahead and bring in my colleagues here, Katy, Jay, and Mellissa. Thank you for being here with us, taking some time. I know you're putting a lot of time in trying to help lots of different communities learn about this book of yours, or the book that you've edited together, and that it is a labor of love, has been going many, many years of work and conversation and deliberation on your part, as well as the part of those who contributed. So let's go ahead and get it started with Jay. Marchal, I always appreciate, I don't know when you started saying this, any pronouns with respect several years ago. And I like that for your pronouns. Please, I would love for you to share with people watching live or watching it later, what is behind this book? What were the thinking? What's going into this? Whatever it is along those lines you'd like to share with us. I appreciate that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bird. Thank you for inviting me and for inviting me back, but all of us, and for giving us some time to talk with all of the folks who learn with and from you. This is a really important topic for a whole bunch of reasons. Mm-hmm. And this is a book. You've had other people on with books, and you know that they take a few years to pull together. These took more than a few years, in part because of the pandemic, but it really started with a series of sessions at our nerdery, when we get together and we have academic conferences in the Society of Biblical Literature and the American Academy of Religion. There was this kind of critical mass growing, really. So the story of this book is really a story about the people in this book, the scholars, and a story about their projects. That there really was already burgeoning, bubbling up for decades, work on trans interpretations of biblical materials, right? And a number of the contributors in this volume, Transbiblical, are those folks. So Justin Sabiatanis, who wrote a really great chapter on the Good Samaritan, had been working on trans approaches for probably the longest time of our contributors. I had done some work in the book Appalling Bodies, and before I worked on that, Joy Layden had been approaching this work. So that's Justin's book, now out for several decades, and there's a really great chapter on how to approach different biblical materials, especially from a Christian perspective. Joy Layden had been approaching kind of trans approaches from another angle. At the time we were organizing, Max Strassfeld's incredible book, Trans Talmud, was in the midst of being revised. It's now an award-winning book from the University of California Press. And there were also like and there it is, Trans Talmud, so good. I think it's available in paperback now. And there were 3 dissertations by Aisha Musa, of Rebecca Weigel, both of whom contributed to this volume, as well as Joe Henderson Marigold, who couldn't participate in the volume, given kind of post demands after the PhD and efforts to publish a dissertation, which is also now out and you can pick up. So there's all this stuff that was happening, right, just among scholars, and getting us to kind of gather and reflect on the already existing and the emerging work in trans biblical hermeneutics, and to focus specifically on what does it mean to read the Bible thinking about or as trans, non-binary, or gender expansive or gender non-conforming folks. And this is in ways that are connected but distinct from queer approaches or other advocacy-oriented approaches like feminist or womanists. And it was also just really crystal clear at the time, and it's only become clearer, how necessary it was to get more people to encounter this work. That, in fact, many biblical scholars for a long time have pointed out that gender is far more complicated than you might think in biblical materials, and that trans and gender and non-conforming folks have been doing things with biblical materials for decades, if not centuries. And that contemporary need, sadly, has only grown since we worked on this project starting about 5-6 years ago. And honestly, I think we'd wish it was a little less relevant than it is today. But it's very important because as our introduction opens with the claim, and something that's controversial but both obvious to many people, is that gender variation is as ancient as stories about creation. Right? So if you know the stories about creation that are canonized in the Jewish and Christian scriptures, right, this is potentially an obvious claim, while it would also be a contentious claim. Right? Biblical materials have always been more gender variable, more transitory, more expansive, more non-conforming than recent interpreters assume, and increasingly people shout and bully. I mean, for Pete's sake, God is plural. God is a they, them in chapter 1. And the deity performs the first gender confirmation surgery in Genesis 2, right? So
that's a fantastic read of that. Removing something.
These texts with all these lenses and assume all kinds of things. In the circles that I've traveled in, they assume like a 1950s false ideal that it didn't even exist in the 1950s of a white picket fence and 2 white people married and beaver, right? As your son, not something else, friends. Be careful.
I was like, wait, what?
But here's the thing, right? Biblical materials have also shown up in trans movements and trans studies. And these movements and studies have been much, much longer than the current panic that is being plainly manufactured by authoritarians in our time and place. Indeed, fascists have long targeted the treatment, the research, and the community building for trans and other gender nonconforming folks. If you don't know the history of this, I encourage you to learn about it. Susan Stryker's work is fabulous in this regard. The most famous picture of a book burning by the Nazis was from 1933, the Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin, right? They were burning research about transition, confirmation, community building, right? So this is why, and so I'm going to hit the historical tip, and we'll probably work on some other angles over the course of our conversation today. This is why using a term like trans or transgender, we actually think is more suited, is better attuned when we're looking at other places and other times, right? which is not to say that the distant past is the same, or that when I'm looking at biblical figures or biblical characters or biblical texts, that these people are the same as the trans folks that you might know, the non-binary young people that you might know, the gender expansive folks around the corner. But what it does do, instead of starting off presuming cisness, which is itself also a very young category, which we're importing onto all sorts of things from different times and places. What you're doing when you do that is you're imposing very narrow and rigid categories of gender and embodiment. But if you pay attention to start with variation, right? To recognize that when we start with transness, there's a supple and more subtle recognition of variation and complexity. So trans is as much a category of analysis. It's certainly also an identity category for many people, but it's not only that. And you'll find that several of our authors in this volume take that up, right? So instead of assuming cisness as if it were a clear thing, and also instead of assuming that cisness are the people who are unchanging, as if everyone's bodies never changes, as if all of our experiences of our gender and how people perceive us in terms of our gender are always stable or firm or fixed or clear. Let's undo that work a little bit. Let's pay attention to actually what life is like for most people and how much work gender is once you start paying attention to it, right? This might mean that when you look at the past, you find transcestors, right? Pun intended, right? Trans ancestors. So when you look at Justin Sabiatanis' chapter, or Mindy Kamalo and Eric Thomas's chapter, or Katy Valentine, one of our co-editors, all three of them do chapters on the canonical Gospels, right? The prologue in John, the Good Samaritan, and Katy will probably tell you more about the Transfiguration in a minute here, right? That might be one way of thinking about the past, looking for transcestors. But another way is just to highlight that this stuff is not new. I know that authoritarians are telling you something else. They're ginning up hate, not because they actually care, but because they want to do things to us and with us and through us, and don't let them, right? So I think about other historical work, right? There's this great volume called Transhistorical, right? That says that we could pay attention to gender, not just in terms of transness, but whenever there are structures of meaning for gender experience, we're going to find people who are outliers to these structures. So this might help us, right? Outliers to structures of gender when we make meaning, right? Or this is another great volume called Trans and Genderqueer Subjects in Medieval Hagiography. Alicia Spencer Hall and Blake Gutt edited that. And not only do we look and we can find these outliers, right, to gendered meaning, Spencer Hall and Blake Gutt are writing about specifically religious subjects and specifically Christian subjects. Christianity is wacky, friends. If you are Christian, you should get into your traditions, because they are more capacious and more variable than you might have known otherwise. And so their work just on medieval times. Let me just tell you this one thing, and then we'll pause. Their work on medieval times is, so well, maybe again, we're using English words. That's okay. English wasn't a language in the first century, so we're always using words anyways to try to translate here. But what if we pay attention to gendered norms? And many times there's transgression. So maybe if we're looking for gender and experience and outliers, or gender norms and transgressions, that'll get us better tuned into what were people actually like, and how are there ways in which that rhymes with people and places now. Thank you, Dr. Bird, for being patient for my start.
Oh no, I'm not. I don't want you to be done with your start. I wanted to ask a clarification. Could you state that title again? The last one you referenced with
sure.
About hagiography, and I'd like you to, if you can say a word about what hagiography is, so that people understand what.
So it's Alicia Spencer Hall.
Okay.
So Spencer Hall's the last name, and Blake Gutt or Goot. I don't know them. G-U-T-T. It's an edited volume. It's called Trans and Genderqueer Subjects in Medieval Hagiography, which is writing about holy people. Hagio, holy, graphe writing, right?
Awesome. Yep. Thank you.
Really, really great volume out a few years ago, and super helpful for thinking about. Now, of course, there's all these folks who've been doing trans work in biblical studies, and also there's trans folks doing work with biblical materials. But if we are really concerned with this question about, like, how do we think about the past and think in terms of gender more capaciously and more sensitively, more subtly, right? And more accurately, without, again, assuming whatever is on our gendered gourds right now, and whatever's turning you on, whatever vexes you or confirms for you about gender, that may not be what confirms or vexes about gender for other people.
Right.
For like, it's really difficult sometimes even to connect with people now, but like people from the past. Yes. So you'll find that in this volume, a bunch of folks do take historical type of approaches. Okay. But I also think one of the arguments of this volume, and in terms of its content, you'll notice that the parts that are uniquely and distinctly Christian in terms of the scriptures are a bit overrepresented, right? And we thought it was important to focus on the distinctly Christian parts of the scriptures, both because, frankly, our Jewish friends, our Jewish scholars and communities have been ahead of most Christians in terms of contemporary ways of dealing with trans and gender nonconforming and non-binary folks, but also the people who are doing the most damage now are Christians, or at least those who are laying claim to those traditions most loudly, right? Hashtag not all Christians, I know, but for all you Christians on the call, these other people are beating you, right? Over and over and over again, and are dictating the terms under which, not just that we're hearing, under which we're living. And there's many, many reasons why we should be deeply worried about that. Not debilitated, but worried about that. So I could say a little bit more about the different kinds of approaches, about like what it might mean to look to the past and look to biblical materials that are trans. But I also think I've taken a bit more time than I wanted to be. Right. Yes, I see someone online says it used to be unmanly to wear a wristwatch. Yes, what counts as color has changed it across time.
Right.
Pink was very, very manly.
Right.
At one point.
I
think maybe we're reclaiming it. Maybe preppy Whitesville. It's been pretty thoroughly reclaimed at this point.
Thank you.
So I'll pause there.
Well, I wanted to comment that when I appreciated when I saw the chapter title that was challenging the binary of cis versus trans, right? I don't know who's actually talking about that particular chapter today, but I loved the conversation of trans cis is also a binary that is it is helpful in many ways because of the way it centers the realities of people who've been put on the periphery. It challenges the normativeness of cisness. I like that. But it is also a binary, which is in and of itself problematic, right? Because of the real lived experiences of people that rarely fall into any kind of a binary, right? There's some slippage there for most of us, right?
Yeah, that's Joy Layden's chapter. And Joy Layden's a fabulous scholar. I don't know if you already put Soul of the Stranger up on the screen.
I haven't yet. Thank you. I needed the help with the title. Thank you for that.
So Joy's chapter is in many ways her working out, like, what is her method after going around and talking. So Joy Layden is a Jewish woman, Jewish trans woman, right? And going around and talking about her projects and her own life, and realizing, I haven't articulated what I mean by a trans reading. And indeed, she focuses on trans experience, but maybe not in the ways that other people might think. So she's describing trans experiences as something that anybody can have.
Right. Which is, that in and of itself is lovely, right?
That there's a slippage between, right? Anytime you experience a slippage between, like, what are the identifying defining roles or categories that you've been given. If you've ever been told to act like a man, to be a lady,
right?
I'm thinking about at least one of my grandparents, for example, and how I and my siblings were treated differently from very, very early on. Right. If you ever experience a dissonance or a slippage between, like, what you were doing or your sense of self and what other people were defining in terms of roles and categories, right? Then that's a trans experience, according to Dr. Layden, right? And so she says, like, Jacob.
Yes.
In Genesis this is a trans, not that Jacob is trans, but has a trans experience,
right?
Because he resists his birth assignment as the second son. It's a gendered role,
right?
At that, right? Yeah. And there are some trans folks who very much would say, no. It's very important that there's a difference between trans and cis people, and we need to historicize both. And then there are trans scholars like Layden who would say, this is falsely stabilizing cisness. This is renaturalizing cisness. This is saying that cisness is something that in fact it's not. And that might matter for things like access to care, right?
Yeah.
So there's all sorts of folks who access hormones or surgery, and it's covered by their insurance, and we're not passing laws about it, and we're not policing it, right? There's all sorts of jokes. When I was growing up about the Sweet 16 nose job, right? We weren't worried about minors getting cosmetic surgery when I was younger. And yet there's this false panic that's being generated because it's about ostensibly something else. So Leighton has a very capacious sense of what transness is, and other chapters have much more narrow and precise ones that are really, really interesting to think with. But since you brought it up, and now I'm really going to be quiet because I want to make sure other folks get it.
We'll hear from Katy and Mellissa and what they wanted to share with us about the book. Katy.
All right, I think I think I'm up. So hey everyone, it's good to be back here again. If I can start, I do want to talk about the book. Obviously, really excited about it. It's been in the works for like 6 years now. Before that, just for anyone who kind of maybe is like me, you're like mostly cis. You really care about this, not quite sure. Maybe like I was 10 years ago, 11 years ago, not quite sure how to kind of begin to engage this material. And I think I was on here about a year ago, and I do the woo stuff. So why not dive in fully right now? Which is that it was in 2014, so 11 years ago. I was driving around in my car wondering what my next kind of project was going to be. I was just finishing my dissertation, and in that horrible space where you've turned it in, but you haven't defended it. And you're all like walking around like this for like several weeks.
Unless you have something really big to focus on.
It's horrible. I wasn't expecting sort of a revelation in this moment in time. But I was driving down the street where I lived and worried about kind of everything. And I heard a voice in the back of the car say, "You're going to work on trans and Bible." Like so clearly, this is the only time this has ever happened, y'all. Despite the fact that I talk about woo, you don't experience woo stuff like every day. Right. So much so that I turned around. I was like, who said that? What was that? Right. Wow. And so that was why I started working on this. I mean, it was something I cared about, but nothing I sort of planned to pursue. So I got busy learning, and I got busy learning by listening. Talking to people, going to a lot of conferences, a lot of where there was kind of mixed crowds, like lots of people welcome. And so then here we are, and I got to collaborate with Jay and Mellissa, which is of course wonderful, and then the other contributors in the volume. So while we talk about trans, as Jay was saying, this is a really, really big category. Sometimes I think we tend to think of it as a really small category. It's actually a really, really big category. And we decided early on that we would also be talking about non-binary. We would be talking about a gender spectrum. And so two of the chapters in the book that may be of interest to people are about what the current contemporary authors call non-binary, or that they can see non-binariness in the characters. So one is the chapter by Aisha Musa, and it's entitled Jail's Gender Ambiguous Motherhood. The second one is by Esther Brownsmith, and they're right next to each other in the volumes, chapters 4 and 5. And Esther's article is about Mordecai. Why do you transgress? Non-binary biblical readings of Mordecai and beyond. And so these are really, really fun chapters. So you all know who Jael is, because she's the wonderful biblical woman who like drives the tent peg through Sisera's head. And so in the name of justice, saving her people, her people. And she often gets overshadowed by Deborah, one of the female judges in the book of Judges. But when Aisha is looking at Jael, Aisha pointed out things, I've read this story a bunch of times, but never really read it. When Aisha is looking at the chapter, Aisha noticed, and as many people have, that there's a lot of pronoun slippage with Jael. Jael is routinely called he.
Oh, I didn't notice that.
I know. Yeah, I didn't know either. Like, I don't think I'd ever read it in Hebrew.
Right.
And so, so there's a lot of slippage, just even in the pronouns with Jael, just like we have maybe it's not slippage, but we have this, they at the very beginning of Genesis for the divine as well.
Right.
And Jael often gets kind of lumped in as like mother of Israel with Deborah.
Mm-hmm.
It's a weird title to give Jael.
Right?
She has these very non-motherly,
Yeah.
but I'm using the really like big air quotes, right? Non-motherly
Yeah.
actions, because she goes in, she kind of does the opposite of the typical mother, where she like gives food to the guy she's about to kill, but then kills. So she has these kind of reversals all throughout the book, or throughout her little two
her story. Yeah. And even the
story.
seduction element, or at least the implication
Yes.
of a seduction to get him into the tent to begin with, right? Like, what
Yeah.
is that a mother? Maybe.
Yeah,
Sure.
right.
Yeah.
Often, yeah, mothers
Mothers do that, but
do have
also,
sex, but yes,
yeah.
but not quite like that usually, right? Like we have these ideal, I mean, like Jay was talking about, even in our culture, right? We have these ideals of what makes a good mother or not a good mother. And does Jael fit those, or is Jael even really female to begin with? Is Jael a woman to begin with? Well, that can be contested. And so it's a really, really fun chapter for those who may consider themselves non-binary, or maybe you're exploring that, or just want to explore it within the biblical text. And then the book of the book of Esther, Mordecai and the book of Esther, and the contemporary author's name is also Esther. So it's super easy, but somehow bizarrely confusing when you're trying to talk about Esther's chapter on Mordecai. But when we think about Mordecai as and put it in air quotes again, the uncle of the biblical Esther, this kind of heroine story where the word God, never even appears, right? Super interesting story just from that perspective. But Mordecai acts a lot like a mother throughout the story. And it even uses language about nursing, like Mordecai and nursing and Esther. And is this supposed to be literal? Is it not? This is debated, right? And so it's just one hint in the story among many, many others that we also might see Mordecai as non-binary, as someone who doesn't really fit into this binary category of man, woman, male, female, like any of the categories that we could create. And Mordecai is a really fascinating character kind of within the story of Esther anyway. And poor Esther has to bear all the brunt of, is she too submissive? Is she queenly? Right. Does she save the people? Does she give in?
Right.
Whatever.
Is she passive? Is she a puppet, or is she active?
Poor thing gets talked about so much, but I feel like we never actually ask her. But so Mordecai is this kind of it's a potentially non-binary character. And so both of these chapters are super readable, super fun, and a super fun way to think about the really wider categories of gender and gender identity.
And does that mothering part start in the fact that they're talked about that he has taken her under his wing in a sense, and that's where
I mean, from really early on, I mean, the implication is, right, she's quite young. Esther's quite young when Mordecai becomes her sole caregiver. And in this, I mean, if Mordecai is coded as male in the ancient world, or through our contemporary readers' eyes, we still have a lot of suspicion about single men who take in kids. Yeah. Right, like that has suspicion today. I don't know for sure. I haven't done the research about the ancient world, but I can imagine, people might raise eyebrows.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that.
At that too. But if Mordecai is non-binary, right, it creates some interesting ways to kind of look at Mordecai's role in raising Esther too. Like, who's teaching Esther how to be a queen? Yeah. Would Mordecai as a cis male know how to do that? I imagine there might be some gaps in Esther's education, if so.
Right. That's lovely.
Dad could not do my hair. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I like it. Thank you.
And I'm happy going into New Testament, or we can shift over to Mellissa and come back, whatever works.
Whichever works for you. I'm happy. I'm not trying to slight anyone. I just want to hear.
I can talk about mine. I can talk about mine really quickly. As the transistor element. So my chapter is on the Transfiguration, and the Transfiguration. Sort of those of you who grew up in church, the story. We read it every year, and it happens in 3 of the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And I talk about the one in Mark, but a lot of these insights could really, really apply to any of the 3. So when I first started talking to people, I did a whole series of interviews with really generous people who are on the trans, non-binary, somewhere on the gender spectrum, who are not cis, I should say. And they were really generous to share their stories with me. And one of the questions I asked is, where, if anywhere, do you see yourself in the biblical story, or what biblical story may inspire you, or and Genesis 1, Genesis 2 would come up a lot. Like those would come up a lot. Some stories would come up a lot. But a lot of people mentioned the Transfiguration. So the first time it got mentioned, I was like, okay, cool. It's like someone's personal, it's important to them. But the third or fourth time it got mentioned, I said, well, this is now a pattern.
Right.
So what's the pattern here? Because it was not just one or two people. And people just routinely told me they saw, like, whatever happens in that Transfiguration, they saw themselves in it. So I said, well, can I create a historical matrix for this? Can we maybe understand this looking at the literature that Jesus, can I prove, if that's the right word, but can I show maybe that Jesus' Transfiguration could have a gender component to it? And so looking at the ancient literature really quickly, we trained ourselves to see other gods who had transformations that look like Jesus. Like there's a lot of Greek gods that it looks very similar. Okay. But it turns out a lot of those stories, and there's several stories about humans too, also include gender transformations. Gods routinely could switch genders, and sometimes humans could too. Sometimes by choice, sometimes not. Sometimes it's like as a punishment. And so it seemed, and a lot of those occur in the same stories where it looks a lot like the Transfiguration. There's light shining, there's dazzling stuff out there. There's sort of clouds, there's mystery, there's all these things happening. And so in just my chapter, I look really as carefully as I can at those stories to hopefully make a case that whatever it is that happens at the Transfiguration could include this gender component too. And so I think we can see Jesus as it could really, in the chapter I talk about Jesus as a trans woman, but we could also see Jesus born as a woman, as a trans male. Throughout. There's so many different ways we could go with this, right? Like depending on your perspective. Where Jesus is multigender, Jesus is non-binary. And so in this, in the Transfiguration, we get so used to just sort of reading it. And it's very simple. It's just like, and then Jesus was metamorphized. That's really all it says. It doesn't tell us what happens. And we don't have the clues now to understand all the stuff that would have happened that the ancient people had. That
they assumed would happen in that scenario.
Yeah, right. So it's just like us saying once upon a time.
Right.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay, I know the setting of that, right? So like they were clued in to the potentials, the potentiality of Jesus on the mountain. And the disciples they look at what's happening and they're really scared. You're like, well, what in the world are they scared of? Well, they may be scared because they're seeing Jesus undergo all these transformations that are really unexpected to them. They just kind of don't know what to make of that. And this certainly mirrors a lot of trans people's experiences. Now, sometimes their friends and family are not so supportive, right? And are kind of like, what is happening? But hopefully at the end they come around, like the disciples eventually do, the very, very end of the story. Yeah, so and then the trans sisters who are there are Elijah and Moses. And we see Moses has a lot of genderqueer stuff about him, her, them. And I'll leave that for, you can read the article about it. But Elijah also is someone who in later traditions becomes an angel. So it's a pretty dramatic metamorphosis in later Jewish and Islamic traditions. Okay. So I kind of see Moses and Elijah as the like, come on, girl, we're gonna walk you through this. We're gonna show you what to do now.
Nice.
Here's your veil. Here's how to wear it. Right? Like we've been here, done this. Right? So you have any community support for Jesus.
Fascinating. And I just keep getting tripped up in a good way by just the fact that we call it a transfiguration without thinking twice about that.
Seriously,
language.
Right? It writes itself. Yeah,
it does on a certain level, right? And all the glory, right? The brightness, the bling, the flash, the whatever.
Yeah, it's a blink. I like that. I should use that word. Yes, that's
right?
great.
I was looking at Jada, my glorified body, and thinking of that. I'm used to that language in a religious context, and then because I know a little bit about Jada, follow Jada's comments and contributions on social media, and I just think, no, let's take that glorified body in a more flashy, instead of holy.
Yeah,
sacred.
right.
And
yeah,
I still think
it's a corporeal thing.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's a bodily thing. Yeah, we're
Yeah.
used to sort of sanctifying all
Yes,
of this.
right.
Yeah,
But
making it
but this is a body
something
that
out
is
there. But yeah, no, it's like
beautiful.
something happening to you.
Yeah, in a beautiful,
Literally, yeah.
blingy kind of way. Yeah. Thank
And
you.
if I may, her
Please do.
chapter is specifically about like glitteriness and sparkling.
Jada's,
Right?
Is
yeah.
it? Jada's
So
is?
it's
It's cool.
definitely assigned reading, and I don't think you'll have to like get glitter out of your apartment after reading it. I can't guarantee it, but it's possible the chapter will stick just as much as that.
Nice.
And,
Pollen Transitions, I think, is a subtitle to her.
Yeah,
chapter,
and
right?
I see in the chat some comments about Inanna. So I'm gonna
Yes.
I'll
Yeah.
chat about
Please
that.
do.
I'll put some
Yeah.
comments in the chat there. So
Oh, okay, great. That was a way back, wasn't it? I didn't
I'll scroll back and see. I got on my soapbox. So.
Yeah. No. Bring the soapbox. That's great.
Well, -M.
Yes.
Is one of the.
They are here often, and so I'm sorry. I saw the comment about Inanna that didn't Inanna also change gender, and I wasn't aware of that. But I haven't read much on Inanna. I read a little bit.
Yeah. So I mean, like really briefly, Aphrodite makes
Sure.
a short appearance in my chapter. So Aphrodite on Cyprus is also akin to Astarte in like Palestine.
Yeah.
It's also akin to Inanna, right? So that same goddess makes the rounds, right, in different forms, and is very gender fluid.
Okay.
Super gender fluid.
I just didn't realize that about.
Yeah, in all those forms, it's fun. Yeah, we're not trained to see it.
Right, for sure.
We're trained to see the binary. We're trained to see it.
Yes.
And like once we stop seeing it, it's right.
Everything's up.
Expansiveness
Everything's
is
in flux. Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I wanted to talk. I don't know if there's much more to say beyond that, and then we're going to hear from Mellissa. But just the fact that the heteronormativity and the cisness associated with that heteronormativity. That most of us, I should say, who grew up in these kinds of faith communities are taught to read onto these ancient texts. For me and my experiences, I can't help myself, right? I have to be intentional about not doing that when I read a story. In general, when it especially comes from biblical context, because of my own experiences in a very conservative fundamentalist experience, way of reading. And I don't want this to be about me, but I'm just trying to say that I think a lot of people are taught to miss or to not notice the things that might make these much more obvious, that this isn't some kind of binary or some kind of strict definition around these roles that people are ascribed. So
yeah, and we, the one in Genesis, right? God is they.
Yeah.
I hear so many explanations of, oh, well, this is the Trinity.
Right.
That's I see how we get there, and that's not a bad explanation, but it's not the simplest explanation.
Right, and it's not terribly
the simplest
respectful.
explanation is that God is they.
Yes, yeah.
There,
and it is a Christocentric
reading
onto an ancient text that doesn't deserve to be read that way. Right? That's a mishandling in my opinion of this, ancient text. Please, Mellissa, please join our conversation. I'd asked each of these folks to address a particular element of this meaty book. There's quite, I didn't notice how many chapters, 12 chapters, or I think 12 or 13.
Yeah, 12.
Yeah. So how to ask these three folks to, in an hour, address all of this in a way that's productive for you all listening. So they've divvied up what they're going to address. So please.
Well, I would like to say thank you, Jennifer, or Dr. Bird. Is it
Jennifer's?
Since Jada Calloway's article has been mentioned, or chapter, let me just say a little more about that. Not only is she talking about glitter and glorification, but also about how she, as a trans person, reads the stories of resurrected glory that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 15, new bodies and so on. So, for example, this one sentence on page 167, for those of you following along in the book, Paul's transformative imagery and terminology that refer to the social and embodied transformations of dying and rising with Christ, resonate with how modern trans people undergo social and embodied transitions as we die daily to our old selves, bend binaries, and rise into our glittery, glorified trans bodies. I'm a trans person. I've known that for most of my life, but hidden, uncertain of how to express myself for a long time, and started publishing on the New Testament primarily in the late 1980s. But it wasn't until I was invited by these two people, I believe, J. Marchal and Katy Valentine, to participate in a panel on transhermeneutics. Was that the title of it? It was sponsored by Gender, Sexuality in the Bible and LGBTQI plus hermeneutics, I think, those two sessions. And so I decided, well, I am a trans person, and therefore I read as a trans person. But I hadn't brought my personal situation, my identity, my own history into my scholarship at all. But one area in which I have worked for quite a while is a gospel that's not in most people's Bibles, if I may. So I transgress
the canon
and migrate over to the Apocrypha, the Gospel of Thomas, which is maybe the best known or most often heard of non-biblical gospel. Gospel of Thomas had always intrigued me because it tells a different story, to the extent there's any story at all. Thomas is a collection of the wisdom and wit and confusing sentences of Jesus,
right?
Presented to us as important to understand. Right at the beginning, the claim is made that the living Jesus, whoever that is meant to be, is speaking mysterious words, and whoever can figure them out will never die. And that's quite a challenge. In fact, it should be on the back of every book, I think. You pick it up and say, hey, figure this book out and you'll live forever. Anyway, the book has a different approach, so that it doesn't tell the story of Jesus with disciples. The Gospel of Thomas doesn't tell about miracles and exorcisms. The devil and Satan are never mentioned. It has no clear connection to any place or time. And so, although my doctoral advisor thought living Jesus meant this went back to the first century, and there's a claim of that Jesus, the historical Jesus, spoke these things, I think it's more likely, sorry, Professor Custer, I think it's more likely that we're referring to the current state of Jesus from the point of view of the text. Because from the point of view of the text, Jesus is an emissary from above, in a parallel way to the Gospel of John, kind of the thought of God become flesh and living among human beings, and trying to alert us as human beings to the divine element within us and our need to find our way back to a non-material existence. And sorry,
It's okay.
my pharmacy's trying to alert me. Just
Okay.
I won't say what. So it's always intrigued me because some of the things stated in the Gospel of Thomas are familiar with the New Testament Gospels, and some are not. Nonetheless, I had never actually written about Thomas from a transgender perspective. And so when I had this invitation, I thought, well, maybe I should do a reading of the Gospel of Thomas from deliberately a trans perspective, and thus very personal. So I take a personal approach, and I don't pretend to speak for all trans people or all scholars or all interpreters. But what do I see when I read a text as a trans person? That's what Jada Calloway is doing. That's what some of our other authors are also doing. We always are doing that, right?
I was going to say, you're just very, very explicit about the fact that, yes, your experience. Right.
And some things that I noticed that I had never really thought about much before is that in my reading, Jesus in Thomas doesn't have a gender, because Jesus is not actually a human being. Jesus
right.
in flesh, is here temporarily as a visitor.
Right.
And although grammar requires sexed or gendered pronouns in the languages that Thomas survives in, Greek and Coptic, it does that's a matter of expression in language, and human language has its limitations.
Mm-hmm.
One little clue that we trans people like, we're very interested in our pronouns. You see, I've spelled mine out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
At one point, infamously, at the end of the text, Gospel of Thomas 1:14, Simon Peter, infamously misogynistic and jealous of Mary Magdalene, says to Jesus, "Make Mary leave us, because women are not worthy of life." That's a really hard statement to hear, although Peter famously elsewhere is kind of a figurehead for anti-female leadership in the church, such as in the Gospel of Mary. But Jesus doesn't exactly deny the perspective that Peter expresses. What Jesus does instead and say, "I myself will lead her and make her into a living spirit like you guys, Peter." And that "you" strikes me as very significant. Not like us. Oh, I can make Mary just like us males,
Mm-hmm.
Too bad that she's a woman, but we can work on that. No, Jesus is distinguishing true identity from gendered separation. So the thing about Thomas that's interesting also is it's a very binary-laden book, which sets up all sorts of fuzzies for trans people and non-binary people. But one of its central binaries is between our fleshly material existence and the spiritual existence we hope to have again with God, wherever heaven is. And anyway, that's part of what I'm after in my chapter called Considering the Body with the Gospel of Thomas. Other chapters that I would, unless someone wants to ask a question about that.
I don't personally, but yeah, and I was looking to see if there were questions, but no, I'm just enjoying taking in.
Let me refer to our final chapter. Mine's the second to last. The final chapter is by Kai Merkley, who's a recent PhD in classical literature, who offers a very interesting reading of an early Christian theologian named Tertullian from around the year 200 in Carthage, modern Tunisia, and focuses on Tertullian's anxieties about dress and comportment. And uses the example of the Greek hero Achilles, who for a while lives as a young woman to avoid the military draft, we would say today, for other reasons. His mother hopes he doesn't have to go off and fight and die in war.
Yeah.
So Achilles is this great masculine martial hero of the Greek and Roman world, and yet he has this phase in which he lives as a female. And Kai is able to show that Tertullian makes use of certain statements, infamous statements to someone like me in Deuteronomy about clothing and gender, as a way to try to police what Christians should be doing. And that sounds very modern to me.
Absolutely.
So the last paragraph of his book, of his article, when Tertullian's polemic against gender crossing might be an odd place to find optimism for trans figures, Tertullian's obsession with gender policing proves that gender needed to be policed because it was contested, and that even within Christianity, there was no easily defined orthodoxy around clothing and its relationship to gender. And so that's a hopeful thing. Some of our authors are offering hope. Justin Sabiatanis's chapter has also been mentioned. Justin is a professor of theology and social justice at United Theological Seminary here in the Twin Cities of Minnesota. And Justin talks about the parable of the Samaritan as he does somewhat in his book that you've mentioned already on transgender and the Bible. As first, the obvious thing maybe, the person who is said to have been beaten up and left for dead in the ditch is probably a Black trans figure, because Justin's very interested in justice. And you know, it's Justice 40 is the discount code for purchasing.
Yes, I didn't want to interrupt what you were saying.
In any case, Justin's very interested in the fact that as a trans person himself, he's aware that it's trans women of color that receive most of the violence and the mortal violence, fatal violence often in our society. Mm-hmm. But then Justin does a really interesting flip.
Right, which is really
where we now see the Samaritan as the trans woman who comes along to offer help. And I find this extremely powerful because we shouldn't shudder back from the different people who are different from us. We should accept their invitation. So anyway, those are two things.
Their humanness. And it made me think about how it seems to me there's a general sticking to ideas that that normative, air quotes, scholarship, ideas, doctrine, theology, all that is focused on this spiritual thing and the ideas that anyone can get on board with versus understanding the humanness and the suffering of this person in the ditch, that the Black trans woman would absolutely connect with the humanity there, and respond tenderly, right? Because this is who we are as humans, right? The humanness is what we connect to.
I don't want to give up the mic before one of the comments. One is to point again to Joy Layden's chapter and the difference between trans experience that any of us have in terms of slippage between categories and transgender experience, but especially my friend and colleague Jay Marchal's chapter, which is a very powerful reading of the Pauline epistles from the point of view not only of transgender studies, but of the abolitionist movement, the anti-carceral movement, and anti-racist movement. And to make sure I get the right title, Captive Genders, Fugitive Flesh, and Biblical Epistles. And Jay, of course, has done a lot of foundational work on the people around Paul, including the enslaved people and the unmen around Paul. But this is a very important chapter for those of us interested, as I hope most of us are, justice issues that relate to incarceration, racial disparities. And I'll let Jay speak for themselves about this, but just wanted to make sure we didn't leave Jay's contribution out of our conversation.
Thank you. Yes, because I know that both Appalling Bodies and another of Jay's edited or single volume. Do you want to chime in here, Jay, to help me out?
Sorry, what are you asking?
The books that you have either written or edited.
There's a few.
I know there are.
A dozen of them, I think.
I know, that's not helpful.
This is the best one yet, though.
Which one? This one is the best one. Yes, I know.
Don't tell Oxford University Press, SBL Press, but this is the best one.
Bodies on the Verge was the other one. Yes, I wanted to put those two out. The Bodies on the Verge and Appalling Bodies. As I tried to prepare for today in a respectful way, I kept thinking about what are the things that we can kind of talk about that are helpful ways to get into seeing a trans engagement, trans hermeneutics, a way of reading or whatever that we can in a sense already identify with. So there's a commonality, and then that gets us to a new place. And I was reading the opening to Max Strassfeld's chapter, which is just the opening. I'm struck by this. I'm going to read it because I can. The opening of Max's chapter in 2018, a memo from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services was leaked to the New York Times. The memo offered a definition of sex. Sex means a person's status as male or female based on immutable biological traits identifiable by or before birth. As the Times reported, this definition would eradicate federal recognitions of trans people who have gone through bureaucratic processes to change their legal status. While nothing in the memo references religion directly, I'm getting sick to my stomach. Journalists traced the language back to its Christian evangelical roots. And the category of sex is currently at the heart of legal and policy wrangling over trans embodiment. So in this chapter, I will practice deliberate anachronism as Max goes on to explain what he's going to do in this chapter. But, how, and this is another from 2 paragraphs down, how might our reading practices need to be shaped by the specificities of the bodily regulation? That's where I'm seeing this connection between all these different chapters, right? Bodily regulation or naming or whatever, and surveillance of intersex and trans people. I think the bodily regulation, I mean, that's what feminists are pushing back on. That's what that's what the reality of denying trans realities in legislation. I remember when this happened, right, in 2018, and how appalled I was. And yet my realities mean I don't have to watch how that's going to play out, right? But for many people I know, that is your daily, that is in focus, right? Yeah. Surveillance and monitoring bodies is a lot of what this is about. Or on the flip side, celebrating the transfigurations. What else do you all want to do? So this is a good point in time to say, if anyone had specific questions for anyone on the panel, this would be a lovely time to.
Well, I also wanted to make sure we circled back because it came up in the chat and around the edges to the conversations. A lot of times people bring up Matthew 19, 11 to 12, right? Yeah. And this mysterious saying of Jesus, right, about the 3 eunuchs. There are 3 kinds of eunuchs, right? And there's all these like throat clearing that happens. Not everyone can handle this. And this isn't for everybody. Right. It's right after saying about marriage and divorce. And it's just like, anyways. And they're like, oh, look, this is a good analogy for trans or gender nonconforming folks now. And we've talked about like a really capacious way of thinking of trans across time, like Joy Layden's argument. But you can contrast it with another piece, and Rebecca Weigel's chapter came up in the chat. It's Trans Historiography and the Problem of Anachronism, Eunuchs and Other Non-Men in Matthew 19 and 1 Corinthians 6-7. And Weigel goes the other direction, like in a really rigorous, kind of daring and provocative argument, I think, that says, like, no, if you want to identify someone as trans from a different time period, here's the one criterion. Like, she does all this labor to kind of think about the different narratives we've used for both transgender and transsexual as terms that we use in the 20th century, the 21st century, right? So if you have a person who is seeking to transition from one category of sexed or gendered intelligibility to another category, so it's a person who seeks to transition from one category of intelligibility to another, or to transition to unintelligibility because of the inadequacy of a culture's categories, Weigel's going to say you could then call that person trans, right? Okay. And so the interesting thing is she then goes through the 3 eunuchs and says, okay, eunuchs who are born this way, not trans by this definition. Eunuchs who are made eunuchs by someone else, not trans.
Because it's not their own intent. Is that what you're saying?
But eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, right? This counts as trans. But then she keeps going. She says, also these people who are rejecting marriage, like that are clearly bubbling around in Paul, in the middle chapters of Paul's vexing letter, 1 Corinthians. Yes. Also trans by this definition. They're moving from categories of sex, gender, intelligibility to another one.
One right? that doesn't conform to what's expected of a female male. Yes. Okay.
Right. So we have 2, like when you're thinking about like using, what's the criteria we're using, right? And for us, it was really very important that this is in process, right? And that's why it was important that this be an edited volume, not a solo authored volume. Jada Calloway is in the middle of writing a book. I think it's going to be crackerjack when it comes out. It's going to be amazing. Get that solo authored book. I don't know if Mellissa and Katy are working on solo authored books right now. If they are, I'm sure they're fabulous too, right? But the point being is that there's so much going on that actually is serious about transness and serious about thinking about these things in a dynamic way. And there's not one way of doing it.
Yes, that's
and for
important.
those of us who want to do this work, you might want to think strategically about, like, okay, sometimes the transcestor vibe is what you want to do. And sometimes you really want to do this historical work. And sometimes you want to get deep into the weeds of language. And sometimes you want to say, like, oh, here's what trans people are saying now, and that's going to guide my work, like Katy did. Or like someone like Justin Sabiatanis is like, look, here it comes down to it. Like, is the goal justice, as Mellissa highlighted a moment ago, right? Does trans hermeneutics will do its job if it liberates humanity from the tyranny of gendered norms, right? So it's possible that the historical work, or like it's possible that Layden's kind of way of talking about trans experience, or Weigel, or me trying to do a little kind of work about in some abolitionist directions, like it's possible, but that's going to be the gauge. And that might be the gauge for you or for other people in the chat or who are listening to this live or later on.
Right.
But if it's not, what is it? And you need to think about for yourselves, what is the standard to which you're going to hold yourself and what you do with authoritative materials? And you will be accountable for that, right? One way or the other. I'm not speaking in any way, like I don't have some supernatural power by that. I just mean like that's ultimately the reality. Right? Nobody says now, well, it wasn't the slaveholders' fault because the Bible endorses, expropriating humans, enslaving them, crushing their children, and raping their women, and sometimes also their children. We don't say, well, the Bible allows it. No. Well, I guess
some people
who would
do,
argue otherwise now. But the majority of people who are in my circles would say, yeah, enslavers are bad people.
Yeah.
Right? The hermeneutic that they used to approach these materials, right? They were responsible for it, right? And I hope that we care more than just how we're going to be remembered. We care about what we're doing now to make the world more habitable, and more humane for humans and other creatures, right? So, yeah. So definitely check out Rebecca's chapter as well as Justice chapter. We heard quite a bit about how to read like the Good Samaritan. Some fabulous stuff. And someone has a request to hear more from Mellissa. I agree.
Yes, Anina. I would love to hear more from Mellissa as well. I don't know if it pertains specifically to this book or to trans hermeneutics in general. I would love to hear more from you as well.
Is Anina the person?
Anina, yeah, Sharonda, yeah. Would
Anina be willing to be more specific about what they would like to hear?
Fair. I imagine she will chime in, and there's about a 10-second delay, so I imagine she will chime in here in a second. I appreciate people. I just found your topic super interesting. Yeah. So the topic on talking about the Gospel of Thomas and considering the body in a text that specifically doesn't actually talk about the body, right? Which is
it's interesting. And thank you for that compliment.
I agree. I had the same response.
I never put my students to sleep in the classroom, but it came close a couple of times. I always stayed awake anyway. But Well, okay, considering the body. So to be more self-revelatory here, I approached the chapter in this book as kind of a self-consideration of my previous work, because I had published 2 or 3 articles arguing that the body really has no value in Thomas. The fleshly body has no value. That our purpose is to leave it, not self-harm, but how through spiritual means or whatever to escape from the world around us with all its suffering and pain and wickedness, And so that is that is where I started. But I know from personal conversation and reading other scholars' work that there are, of course, trans people and non-binary people who find more joy in their bodies. We've talked about glitter and glory and joy.
Yes, exactly.
I can't say that I've ever felt that way myself about my own body. I have said in some of these other podcasts that my body tells lies about me every day. But still, I wanted to take account of the fact that I don't speak for all trans people, and I wanted to acknowledge that there are ways in which we can understand even the Gospel of Thomas's approach as giving more space for a variety of responses to our bodily existence, without necessarily having to go all the way in the direction of the spiritual body that Paul tries to explore.
Mm-hmm.
That our physical existence can bring us happiness and joy too, and it does for me. Just went to a wonderful Broadway touring show last night, and it was
nice.
Kimberly Akimbo. But still, there's a lot of struggle and pain in being trans, and right now, Jennifer just mentioned this. Those of us living in the United States who are openly trans are under a lot of pressure. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. I don't know what to say in response to that. I do want to acknowledge it. And I'm sorry. It's really a lousy response. That's all I can say, I think. I see you and appreciate you. Thanks for being here. All right. Well, it's a good podcast when I tear up, right? It's a good stream. Something important has been said. Thank you all. I know that the three of you, put a lot of work and time and tears and sweat and thoughtfulness into engaging your colleagues and inviting conversations and hosting them and responding and editing and pulling things together. Yeah, I'm just going to share this. Oops, thank you. Yeah, I'm sorry for what you're experiencing. You are valid and welcome on this earth. It's a lovely thing to say. Also, thank you for the super chat, LDEM. I appreciate you all teaching me more of this topic. That's my favorite kind of response to something, so people find something new. Yeah. So thank you all for being here. I appreciate those of you who are here with us live and enjoying each other's banter, which I saw some comments about that. And I appreciate those of you who will be watching this later. I hope that some of you might even feel like sharing the link to this conversation with someone who you think might also appreciate it. I'm going to see if I can. Oh dear. I'm going to see if I can. I did not see this chat, so I'm happy to throw a few links into the chat that I just now saw in our sorry about that, in our private chat. I will put some of these links also in the description, since that is a helpful way for it to for people to access it. Thank you, Shi Hengfa, for commenting, for the quick super chat, and for affirming that there's something useful for you in this conversation. I'm going to kick you all out, and I don't know, since some things shifted apparently in the media, I don't know if my closing video is going to work or not. So
can we just, before we go?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
It's okay.
Yes.
Well, first of all, thank you, everyone. Thank you for those joining live and checking this out later. I want to give a huge shout out to all the contributors. We didn't even get to all the chapters.
Yeah.
And the good news is if you have internet, there's two places already that you can encounter, right? You can read the introduction, and I believe the first chapter for Transbiblical, on the Westminster John Knox Press website.
Okay.
So you could check that out there. And also our colleague, Katy Valentine, if there were particular chapters that you were interested in, Katy is doing so I know I'm plugging another podcast on a podcast. I don't know if that's a podcast.
That's okay.
Podcast,
yes, please.
Faux
please.
pas. A faux
nope,
pas.
Not here.
There is a Transbiblical podcast with individual episodes on individual chapters,
Excellent.
as well as other folks engaging with the project. And I think there's going to be rolling out more as we
Fantastic.
go along. So if you're like, I'm not a big reader, like we're not on audiobooksville yet. That's a great digestible, accessible way to grapple with the work that's here, right?
And
Is that
those
in
of you
the
who want
Katy
more AMSR Mellissa, there's an episode with Mellissa, and so and many others. Yeah, and so Jennifer put that link, but it's available on my YouTube and on all places where you would get podcasts. It's just called Transbiblical. It's the only one. You won't miss it.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Okay.
And it's really good. Katy's wonderful.
Oh,
She's a
it's
lovely
fun.
host.
It's very fun. Yeah, I'm a little behind right now because of travel, but more episodes coming soon.
Excellent. Yes. Any other final words that you'd like to throw out there? I'm sorry. Thank you for that, Jay, for interrupting to make sure we get these plugs that need to happen.
Crowd here is amazing as always. So
They're lovely. I know.
Yes.
And
crowd. Yes.
And for those who do want to purchase the book, I know not all of us are capable or able. Right. I do hope that there is the discount code. I'm sure it's been mentioned already, but be sure
times.
To check. Do you have show notes or whatever it is? Go back and rewind. It's going to be there, 40% off. It's very reasonable for a book of this heft, I would say.
Right.
And there's so much. It's much easier for me to praise work when it's collaboratively created with such amazing people. These co-editors, our contributors, the folks who weren't able to contribute, the folks who supported us, and there are many, many folks that we wouldn't have time to name for those things. So it's like I said at the beginning, it's a project about people and about our projects. So it's a real pleasure. And it is an unfortunate necessity right now to take this stuff seriously. Yeah.
It is.
Thank you, everybody.
Final words?
It doesn't look like there's an Amazon Day Prime deal. Of course, we prefer supporting the publisher, but it is a good price on Kindle for those who are e-readers.
Good to know.
It's a good deal on Kindle if you like to read that way.
Great. Thank you. Any other closing thoughts before we wrap this up? I'm so glad Harris was here. Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to kick you out and see if I can do this. Thank you. It's more somber kind of a moment here. Something has changed in the YouTube frame, so I'm going to see. Yeah, it is not letting me do a thing as my. Let's see if it works. Let's see if it does it this way. Nope. Okay, so I'll have to work on that. Thank you all. Thank you for all the ways that you all support me and the work I'm trying to do, or the work I'm trying to highlight, and the scholars I'm trying to engage. Thank you for supporting me. Anytime you subscribe to a channel, that helps other people who are interested in the same things to find it. So that's the way the algorithm works. So thank you for subscribing to the channel, sharing links, videos that you're particularly fond of, or commenting, all the different things. You can support me through Patreon. I'm at Biblical Bird, or through the memberships here on this YouTube channel. And next time I'll have the intro, outro music, the thing that I love so much about having the fun music to kind of set the mood. So anyway, thank you. See you all next week.